Hello, AP Gov. Today's lecture is going to be looking at the making of the Constitution. So, in the past two lectures, we've been looking at some of the problems, with the Articles of Confederation, and also looking at the origins of the Constitution. So, even before the Articles, some of the issues and things that were there. So today, looking at this idea post articles. So we ended last time by saying that there was a special called meeting in Philadelphia the following May after an Annapolis meeting in 1786, and they met in Philadelphia. So these delegates were given specific instructions to meet for the sole purpose and the express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. 55 men from 12 of 13 states were there. Rhode Island refused to participate. Most of these individuals were wealthy planters and merchants, so higher class. Most were college graduates with some political experience. And again, this is a kind of a must in these situations because you are wanting some of your more educated to be forming and looking at what is needed as far as change. Many were coastal residents from larger cities, so New York, the D.C. area, so forth, so on. So again, these are not rural areas that are being represented. But the 55 delegates ignored their instructions. It's kind of like your parents telling you to do something and you specifically ignore it. So their philosophy was to go into action. Human nature, which is self-interest and self-interested. Political conflict, which leads to faction. So this idea of you have special interest groups that can actually cause more friction because of the needs that they have. The objects of government, including the preservation of property, the nature of the government, which sets up power against power so that no one faction rises above and overwhelms another. So here at this convention, this is their philosophy, or their philosophies that they're bringing to the table. And again, this was a meeting that was set up to revise, change, edit. So on the agenda, equality issues, women and men, minorities, equality issues. Also, you're looking at equality and representation of the states. So like we talked about before, smaller and larger populated states had differing needs. Some are rural, some are a little more urban for the time, but equality for the representation of the states was something that was an issue. So delegates started to bring together some of these differing issues. So the New Jersey Plan, this is something that hopefully from civics that you remember, but the New Jersey Plan. New Jersey is a smaller state. They wanted equal representation in the states. Virginia Plan had a population-based representation. Well, Virginia is a larger area. They had more people to represent, so their delegates brought this idea to the table in order to represent the larger populated areas. So in the creation of the Constitution, obviously compromise is a must. But once the articles were pitched, this idea of trying to get rid of factions and trying to have a balanced government. This is where your idea of a bicameral Congress comes into play. But the Connecticut Compromise is going to create a blend between the two. So that's where you get the idea of the Senate, where each state has 2 representatives, and then the Virginia plan, looking at the representatives in Congress, or the House of Representatives, is a population-based representation. Every 10 years, you do have a census. Through that census, the representation and the number of representatives is changed. 2020 has been an interesting year in looking at the census because of what's happening with our present situation. And it is a very important part of the Constitution every 10 years because of our population-based representation and how that is going to play out. But it is the Connecticut Compromise. You will hear it called the Great Compromise as well. But this compromise comes into play and does create what we call a bicameral legislature in the Senate, which is a 2-house Congress. So slavery is definitely an issue in government. This is not a United States history class, but we do have to talk about the fact that slavery is an issue. As time wears on, you come into contact with a country itself, just the importation of slaves. The Constitution stated that persons legally held to service of labor who escaped to free states had to be returned to their owners. So again, this idea of property, one of the court cases that we will look at and that you will have to know is the Dred Scott case. And that is looking at the idea of the Supreme Court ruling basically that slaves were property. They're not people, they're property. The 3/5 Compromise comes into play, saying that both representation and taxation were to be based upon the number of free persons plus 3/5 of the number of all other persons. So the language there is saying basically if you were white and free, because you did have indentured servants and things still at this time, but the number of free persons and then all other persons, which would be slaves for the most part, fit into this 3/5 of all other persons. Political equality and voting left to states. One of the big ideas here is going to be some delegates favored suffrage or the right to vote for all free adult males. Some wanted to put property qualification on the right to vote. Ultimately, they decided to leave the issue to the states. So each state got to determine who got to vote and who did not, what qualifications were there. Obviously, this is going to change over time, but political equality was left to the states as far as voting rights. This graphic is right out of your book, but it does give you the problems that we just talked about, and it gives you the solutions. So you can pause this if you want to look at this chart. The economic issues that the Constitutional Convention faced. States had tariffs on products from other states. So when you talk about tariffs, tariffs are taxes on imported goods, and the out-of-state shipping. There were tariffs from shipping from one state to the next, which was problematic. So advocates were looking at how to handle this situation. Paper money was basically worthless. If you think back to this idea of debtors and creditors that was discussed earlier, they were basically looking at how can paper money be distributed, created, and the value of it not become worthless. So the actions that were taken. Powers of Congress had to be strengthened. Again, the Articles of Confederation did not give power to Congress or an executive to do much of anything. The powers of the states had to be limited, taking away this idea of a confederation and creating more of a federalist type of plan or federalism, which we will talk about later. So in this chart, you can see the powers of Congress that were created from being able to levy taxes, pay debts, borrow money, coin money, regulate its value, regulate interstate and foreign commerce. And you can read through all of these things, then putting limits on the states or prohibitions, as it says. So states cannot pass laws impairing the obligations of contract. At the federal level, states cannot coin money or issue paper money, because if you have different currencies in different states, like we did under the Articles of Confederation, that's problematic. It's just like going to another country and having to, figure out how much it is the U.S. dollar worth and be able to trade in money. Other key provisions: the new government assumes the national debt contracted under the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution guarantees a republican form of government, and the states must respect civil court judgment and contracts made in other states. Individual rights issues, some were written into the Constitution. So the writ of habeas corpus. Basically, the writ of habeas corpus is the right of the government to hold someone basically against their will in times of need. So you are able to hold someone captive, almost like jail or holding them without actually going through a process or due process of law. You will see this in the Civil War, in which Abraham Lincoln is going to do the same thing. You can see here some of these other things that are laid out. The idea of ex post facto laws. are looking at the fact of the idea of being able to or not able to retroactively change the legal consequences of actions that were committed or relationships that existed. So basically, new laws cannot apply to people operating before the new law was passed. So you can't retroactively punish someone for a law that was not put in place when that action was taken. They took away the religious qualifications for holding office. The United States is one of the few countries in the world that does not have an official religion. Based on the First Amendment, we do not have, you have religious freedom, which is something that is very unique to a lot of other places that are in the world. Strict rules of evidence for conviction of treason, the right to trial by jury in criminal cases. So some of these basic rights that we think about were talked about and discussed on the agenda for the Constitutional Convention. Freedom of speech and expression, again, a First Amendment rights of the accused. And all of this is going to come to a head. And James Madison is known as the father of the Constitution, and the Madisonian model is one that is very important for us to understand, and we will look at a graphic here in a minute to help you understand. So this model is based on the idea to prevent a tyranny of the majority. Madison proposed a government of the following: limiting majority control. This is also known as the tyranny by majority. Madison believed that it was essential to keep most of the government beyond the control of the masses. So under his plan, it was incorporated in the Constitution. The voters' electoral influence was limited and mostly indirect. So through separating powers, you were able to vote. You were able to vote for your representatives. And that indirect model took the power away from the majority. His model was allowing the House of Representatives to be directly elected. Senators and presidents were indirectly elected. Judges are nominated. If this is modified by the 17th Amendment, which provides for direct popular election of senators, that does not come about until the progressive movement in the early 20th century. So our separation of powers and checks and balances is a very unique idea, but the scheme provided for a system of separation of powers in which each of the three branches of government would be relatively independent of the others so that no single branch could control the others. So that checks and balances system is going to allow for each branch to have specific powers and checks on each other, which again is very unique and something that had to be well thought out. Not giving sole power to one branch and not allowing one branch to be too powerful. The Again, we'll talk about federalism very soon, but this federal system is, again, very unique. So the idea here initially, this electoral process, the original plan, and you can see this, the voters through Electoral College vote for a president. Now we have 4-year terms. This was not something that was actually put into place until later. George Washington served two, and he was one that stepped away from the presidency after 8 years, saying that 2 terms was enough. But we still had 4-year terms. It was just not dictated by the Constitution originally that they could only serve 2 terms. The judiciary had lifetime terms. The Supreme Court is still that way once they are nominated and approved. The Senate has 6-year terms. The House of Representatives, 2-year terms. The state legislatures actually voted for the senators, not the voters. And again, that was changed with the 17th Amendment. The House of Representatives were directly voted for by the people. Here you see the Madisonian model and the checks and balances which were put into place. So some of these checks, for example, the president checks Congress by holding the veto power. But even with that veto power, Congress can override the veto with a 2/3 vote. You can also see that Congress holds the purse strings of government, and the Senate has the power to approve presidential appointments. One thing that is mentioned here is Marbury v. Madison. This was a situation where John Adams, during his one term in office, made what were called the midnight appointments for Supreme Court justices. And on his last eve of president, his appointments went in, and a certain individual challenged this. And what created out of this was not so much the idea of these midnight appointments and justices and who was appointed and who wasn't. It created this idea of judicial review. So judicial review is the power of the courts to hold executive and congressional policies unconstitutional, which gave the Supreme Court the legislative branch and the executive branch were following the Constitution. So basically, they are interpreting the law. The constitutional republic. So the basic definition of republic is a form of government in which the people select representatives to govern them and make laws, which is what we have. It does favor the status quo. Change is slow, and you can still see that today. The status quo is something that, when challenged, can be very difficult to overturn. So the end of the beginning, the document of the Constitution was approved, not unanimously, but now it had to be ratified, and this became a very tedious situation. This situation, because this was not unanimous, there were basically 2 groups of people that were coming together, and you had basically the foundation of the first 2-party system in the United States through the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. There's a video that is posted, and your assignments for the Anti-Federalists and Federalists will be a very important part in understanding the ratifying of the Constitution. You can see the Anti-Federalists, which, when you think about this, you can think about Thomas Jefferson and the individuals there, that small farmers, shopkeepers, laborers, that they favored strong state governments, a weak national government, direct election officials, shorter terms, rule by the common man. Basically, they did not want a very strong centralized government. they wanted more powers for the states. Federalists, on the other hand, were large landowners, wealthy merchants, professionals. And you can see that their thoughts are basically the polar opposites of those of the Anti-Federalists, and something that we will talk about in class and through your assignments. The Federalists started what were known as the Federalist Papers. So the Federalist Papers were created by the Federalists. These were articles written mainly by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison, under the name Publius, and they were defending the Constitution. They were written mainly in pen names, not in their actual names. But these Federalist Papers were supporting the Constitution, and they were laid out for the people. One of the biggest arguments that the Anti-Federalists had is that there was not what they called a Bill of Rights. We know that these are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. They were drafted in response to some of the basic concerns of the Anti-Federalists, that basic liberties of the people were not guaranteed.